For 99% of human history, there were no pads, no tampons, no Advil. So what did women actually do? Periods have happened to roughly half the human population every single month for as long as humans have existed. That's hundreds of thousands of years. And yet, pads and tampons as we know them, they're barely 100 years old. So for basically all of human history, people had to figure this out themselves. And what they came up with ranges from surprisingly clever to absolutely terrifying. Let's go civilization by civilization. Let's start in ancient Egypt, around 1500 BCE. Egyptian medical texts, like the Ebers Papyrus, actually talk about menstruation, which was rare for the time. Some historians believe Egyptian women used softened papyrus, rolled and shaped, almost like a primitive tampon. Now, I have to be honest with you, this one's debated. Some Egyptologists think the evidence is thin and that Egyptian women mostly just used cloth like everyone else in the ancient world. But the papyrus theory keeps showing up because papyrus was cheap everywhere, and Egyptians were already using it for basically everything else. Writing, sandals, even boats. Either way, one thing is clear. Menstruation wasn't hidden in Egyptian society the way it became in later cultures. It was talked about medically, not just whispered about. That changes dramatically once we get to Greece and Rome. The Greek physician Hippocrates, yes, that Hippocrates, the father of medicine guy, actually wrote about menstruation directly. Greek texts describe using lint wrapped around small pieces of wood, essentially a wooden-handled tampon made of soft fabric. The Romans took a similar approach. Wool, wrapped and softened, sometimes with wooden or bone applicators. Sounds almost modern, right? Here's the catch. None of this was disposable. Everything was washed and reused over and over by hand, usually in cold water, usually in secret. Because even though doctors wrote about periods clinically, regular society still treated menstruation as something shameful or even magically dangerous. Roman writer Pliny the Elder claimed menstrual blood could sour wine, kill crops, and dull knives just by being near it. So, advanced for its time materials, wrapped in complete social stigma, a pattern that's going to repeat for the next 1,000 years. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and things actually get less sophisticated in some ways. Most women used rags, literally strips of cloth, usually wool or linen, that were folded, tied with string, and worn inside undergarments. Washed, dried, reused, every month, for years. And this is exactly where two phrases you've definitely heard come from: on the rag and time of the month. Both trace directly back to medieval and early modern menstrual cloths. Here's the part that gets left out of most history classes. Many medieval women didn't even wear underwear regularly, so some historians believe menstrual blood was simply allowed to flow onto layers of skirts, which were dark-colored specifically to hide stains. Free bleeding wasn't a modern political statement. For a lot of history, it was just reality. And socially, the stigma got worse, not better. Religious texts across medieval Europe often labeled menstruating women as unclean, restricting them from church, from cooking, sometimes even from touching other people's food. Now, let's look outside Europe, because some of the most resourceful solutions came from indigenous cultures in North America. Materials varied by nation and region, but commonly included things like moss, which is naturally absorbent and even mildly antibacterial, along with soft buffalo hide, shredded bark, and woven plant fibers. Some Native American cultures also had a completely different social approach. Instead of treating periods as shameful, certain nations observed moon time as a period of rest and spiritual significance. Women would step back from daily labor, not because they were unclean, but because it was considered a time of power or renewal. That's a pretty sharp contrast to what was happening in Europe at the exact same time in history. Across a lot of cultures, from parts of Nepal to ancient Rome to medieval Europe, menstruating women were physically isolated. In some regions, this practice still exists today in the form of red tents or menstrual huts, called chaupati in parts of Nepal, where women are sent to sleep separately during their period. Sometimes this was framed as spiritual protection. Sometimes it was framed as impurity, but the practical effect was often the same. Menstruation was treated less like a normal biological function and more like something to be hidden, managed in secret, or physically removed from the household, which makes what happens next kind of ironic. Here's where it gets interesting. The modern disposable pad wasn't invented for periods at all. During World War I, a material called cellucotton, made by Kimberly-Clark, was developed as a cheap, super-absorbent surgical bandage for wounded soldiers. But battlefield nurses noticed something. Cellucotton was way more absorbent and more comfortable than anything they'd been using personally for their own periods. So nurses started repurposing surgical bandages as makeshift pads. Kimberly-Clark noticed the trend and in 1920 released the first commercial disposable pad, Kotex, short for cotton texture. Tampons with applicators came later in the 1930s, invented by Dr. Earl Haas. So the takeaway, the products we now consider basic necessities are barely a century old. Every generation before that, literally thousands of generations of women, managed with cloth, moss, wool, papyrus, or nothing at all. So next time period products feel like a minor inconvenience, remember, for most of human history, there was no aisle at the store for this. There was cloth you washed by hand, moss you gathered yourself, or wool you reused for years. Often while being told the whole thing was shameful or even dangerous. It's wild that something half of humanity has dealt with every single month forever only got a real solution about 100 years ago. If you learned something you never got taught in school, subscribe, because history class definitely skipped this one.